Somewhere in the American Midwest, in the quiet stretch of land where the Mississippi River bends slowly southward, there is a field. On the surface, it looks like any other field in Illinois. Flat, green, peaceful. The kind of landscape you might pass through without a second thought, a brief blur of farmland seen from a car window, or a patch of earth you might cross without ever once wondering what lies beneath your feet. But this field holds a secret. Beneath the ordinary surface of this Illinois countryside, buried under centuries of soil and silence, lies the memory of one of the most extraordinary cities ever built in the entire history of North America. A city that, at its peak, was home to as many as 20,000 people, perhaps more. A city with a skyline shaped not by steel and glass, but by enormous earthen pyramids rising above a vast open plaza. A city connected by trade routes that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. A city whose influence rippled outward across a continent, and yet almost no one knows its name, Cahokia. At its height, around the year 1100 of the Common Era, Cahokia was larger than the city of London. It was, by nearly every archaeological measure, the greatest urban center that had ever existed north of the Rio Grande. And then, quietly, slowly, over the course of several generations, it disappeared. The people left. The buildings crumbled. The wooden walls rotted into the earth. And the land absorbed what the city had left behind, its mounds, its plazas, its pottery, its stories, until only the largest structures remained visible, looming silently above the Illinois floodplain like questions that had never been answered. How did this city rise? Who built it? How did 20,000 people come to gather in one place, in the heart of North America, nearly 1,000 years ago? And why, after generations of growth and prosperity and ceremony and trade, did they leave? Those questions have never fully been answered. But the search for those answers has led archaeologists into one of the most fascinating and most underappreciated chapters in all of American history. This is the story of Cahokia. Welcome to history's sleepy time. If you enjoy calm, immersive history documentaries, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a new journey. Now, let us travel back nearly 1,000 years. To a time before roads, before cities as we know them, before the name Illinois had ever been spoken, to a place where the river was everything and everything was possible. The city hidden beneath the fields. If you were to fly low over the landscape just east of St. Louis, Missouri, on a clear autumn morning, you would see something that has puzzled visitors for centuries. Rising from the flat Illinois floodplain like a great, wide-shouldered mountain, something that does not belong in a landscape as level as this, you would see a platform of earth 100 feet tall, covering an area larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza at its base. It is broad and terraced, built in stages, each layer rising above the last like a staircase ascending toward the sky. This is Monks Mound. It is the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in all of North America. And it was built entirely by human hands, without the assistance of wheels, draft animals, or metal tools, using nothing more than woven baskets filled with earth, carried one load at a time over the course of many generations. It sits today in the middle of a state historic site in Collinsville, Illinois. If you visit on a quiet weekday morning, you might find yourself nearly alone on its grassy slopes. The mound overlooks a landscape of highways and shopping centers and the distant glitter of the St. Louis Arch across the river. But if you stand at the top of Monks Mound and let your eyes settle on the horizon, and if you allow yourself to imagine the surrounding landscape stripped of everything modern, the roads, the developments, the power lines, you begin to sense the true scale of what once stood here, because Monks Mound was not alone. At its peak, the site we now call Cahokia contained more than 120 earthen mounds. They ranged from small, low platforms barely a few feet tall to enormous ceremonial structures visible for miles in every direction. Between and around these mounds stretched a city, a living, breathing, populated city, with thousands of homes, open markets, ceremonial spaces, workshops, and public plazas. Monks Mound anchored the center. Around it, the city spread outward in organized rings, neighborhoods arranged with remarkable deliberateness, with homes facing the great central plaza, with public structures positioned to align with the movements of the sun. The city had been planned, not stumbled into. Planned with intention and vision that speaks to a degree of social organization that most people in the modern world have never associated with ancient North America. And yet, today, most Americans have never heard of Cahokia. This is perhaps one of the strangest facts in all of American history. Here in the geographic center of the United States, within easy distance of one of the country's largest cities, lies the remnant of a civilization whose achievements rival those of the ancient world, and it has remained, for most of American cultural memory, essentially invisible. Part of this invisibility came from the centuries of farming that gradually flattened many of the smaller mounds, absorbing them back into the agricultural landscape. Part of it came from the simple fact that Cahokia was built of earth rather than stone. It left no dramatic ruins in the way that stone temples and marble columns announce themselves to later generations. And part of it, perhaps, reflects something deeper in the way American history has long been told, a tendency to begin the story of this continent with European arrival, rather than with the long, complex, extraordinary chapters of human civilization that preceded it. But the story of Cahokia refuses to remain buried. Every decade, new excavations reveal another detail of this lost city's life. Every careful analysis of soil samples and ceramic shards and skeletal remains adds another sentence to a story that had seemed, for so long, impossibly silent. And that story begins not with the city itself, but with the land. Because long before Cahokia existed, the landscape that would one day hold it was already being shaped, slowly and quietly, by forces of nature that would make everything possible. Before Cahokia, the ancient Mississippi landscape. To understand why Cahokia grew where it did, you have to understand the river. The Mississippi River, the great, slow-moving spine of the North American continent, has been flowing for millions of years. It drains an enormous watershed, pulling water southward from the Rocky Mountains in the west, from the Appalachians in the east, gathering streams and tributaries across a vast interior plain before finally exhaling into the Gulf of Mexico. The stretch of the Mississippi that concerns us, the section near the confluence with the Missouri River, just north of where the Ohio River joins from the east, is one of the most geologically active stretches of the entire river system. Here, over thousands of years, the river has shifted course repeatedly, carving new channels, depositing enormous quantities of sediment, and creating a broad, fertile floodplain called the American Bottom. The American Bottom is a ribbon of lowland on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, stretching roughly 80 miles in length and between 5 and 12 miles wide. It is one of the most naturally productive agricultural landscapes in all of North America. The soil in the American Bottom is extraordinarily rich. Centuries of flooding have deposited layer after layer of fine alluvial sediment, dark, deep, mineral-laden earth that holds moisture well and responds generously to cultivation. Even before anyone began farming here, the land was staggeringly productive in a natural sense. It produced dense stands of wild grasses and edible plants. Its shallow lakes and backwater channels teemed with fish, waterfowl, mussels, and other aquatic life. Its forests, oak, hickory, walnut, elm, offered game, nuts, and construction materials in abundance. In the spring, the river would flood, rising over its banks and spreading across the low-lying areas of the bottom. These floods were not always welcome, but they were not purely destructive either. They replenished the soil. They opened new fishing opportunities as fish moved into the shallower water across the floodplain. They deposited fresh nutrients across fields that might otherwise have been exhausted by continuous cultivation. The climate of the region during the period when Cahokia flourished was somewhat warmer and more stable than it is today, a period that climatologists refer to as the medieval warm period, which lasted roughly from the 9th century through the 13th century of the Common Era. During this time, growing seasons in the interior of North America were slightly longer, rainfall patterns were more reliable, and agricultural output in places like the American Bottom was consistently high. The land, in other words, was generous. To the west, across the river, the Missouri Ozarks provided chert, a flint-like stone ideal for making tools and projectile points. Nearby woodlands offered timber in quantity. And the river system itself, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, and their countless tributaries, functioned as a natural highway network, connecting the American Bottom to communities across an enormous geographic range. A person standing in the American Bottom 1,000 years ago stood at the center of a natural crossroads, a place where resources were abundant, where travel in multiple directions was possible, and where the land itself seemed to invite gathering. Nature had been preparing this place for a very long time, and slowly, steadily, people began to notice. The earliest human inhabitants of the American Bottom arrived thousands of years before Cahokia. Archaeologists have found evidence of human presence in this region stretching back perhaps 10,000 years or more, to the time when the last great ice sheets were still retreating northward, and the landscape was being reborn in their wake. These earliest inhabitants were mobile peoples, moving with the seasons, following game, harvesting wild plants at the right moments of the year, returning to productive locations again and again as their knowledge of the land deepened across generations. Over time, as the climate stabilized and plant communities settled into familiar patterns, these mobile lifestyles began to shift. People began spending more time in places that offered concentrated resources. They began returning each year to the same locations. They began leaving behind the first faint traces of something that would one day become a community, a shared place, a shared life, a shared story. The American bottom was becoming home. The first communities. Long before Cahokia rose into the sky, the American bottom was already a populated landscape. It was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a place where people had been living, adapting, building knowledge, and passing that knowledge forward across uncountable generations. The cultures that inhabited this region in the centuries before Cahokia's rise belong broadly to what archaeologists call the woodland tradition, a term that encompasses a wide range of communities across eastern and central North America, united not by a single culture or language, but by shared technologies, shared practices, and shared relationships with the natural world. Woodland peoples in the American bottom were not, by the time we begin to focus on them, purely nomadic hunters. They were farmers, or at least, they were becoming farmers. The process was gradual. Agriculture in eastern North America did not arrive all at once, as a sudden revolution. It crept in, slowly, over centuries, as people began managing wild plants more deliberately, cultivating certain species that responded well to human attention, and gradually developing dependencies on cultivated crops that would eventually reshape their entire way of life. Among the earliest cultivated plants in this region were varieties of what archaeologists call the Eastern Agricultural Complex, a collection of native plants including sunflower, marsh elder, goosefoot, and erect knotweed that were gradually domesticated by woodland peoples over many centuries. These plants were productive. They were storable. They could be grown in the rich bottomland soils of the American bottom with relatively modest effort, and they provided a reliable, calorie-dense supplement to the wild game, fish, and foraged plants that already sustained these communities. Village life in this period was modest by the standards of what would come later. Homes were typically built of wooden posts covered with bark, woven mats, or bundled grasses, structures that were warm in winter, relatively cool in the humid summers, and practical in their simplicity. Villages were small, perhaps a few dozen to a few hundred people living together in loose clusters of households connected by family ties, shared ceremonial obligations, and the practical necessities of cooperative labor. But these small villages were not isolated. Woodland peoples across the eastern half of North America were connected to one another by exchange networks, routes along rivers and trails that carried not only physical goods, but ideas, technologies, ceremonies, and relationships across enormous distances. Copper from the Great Lakes region made its way to communities hundreds of miles to the south. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast appeared in sites deep in the interior. Distinctive styles of pottery and ritual objects spread from one community to another, suggesting connections maintained over generations of contact. The American bottom, positioned at the heart of the river system, was already a hub of this larger network. Communities that had access to trading partners in multiple directions. They received goods and ideas from the north, south, east, and west, and they sent their own goods outward in return. Pottery became increasingly sophisticated during this period. Archaeologists have recovered fragments from the American bottom that show remarkable skill, thin-walled vessels with intricate surface treatments, fired to a consistency that speaks to generations of accumulated technical knowledge. Pottery was not merely utilitarian. It was also symbolic, its designs reflecting cosmological beliefs, clan identities, and ceremonial meanings that we can sometimes glimpse but rarely fully understand. Burial practices in this period also reveal something of the spiritual and social world of these communities. The woodland tradition is associated, across much of eastern North America, with the construction of burial mounds, low earthen structures raised over the remains of the dead. These mounds were not, for the most part, the large platform mounds of later Mississippian culture. They were smaller, rounder tumuli of earth heaped over carefully arranged burials, often accompanied by offerings of copper, shell, stone tools, and pottery. The construction of these mounds required cooperative labor, more people working together than any single household could provide. This suggests that even in this early period, communities in the American bottom had developed mechanisms for organizing collective effort, for directing shared labor toward goals that went beyond mere subsistence. Someone or some group of people was capable of motivating a community to work together on projects that served ceremonial or symbolic purposes rather than purely practical ones. This capacity for collective action would prove, in the centuries ahead, to be one of the most important ingredients in Cahokia's rise. Generation after generation lived in this landscape. They learned its rhythms, they improved their techniques, they grew in number. They deepened their connections to each other and to the land, and slowly, invisibly, like the accumulation of sediment on a river bottom, the foundations of something much larger were being laid. Then, somewhere around the beginning of the 11th century of the Common Era, everything began to change. The birth of a great city there is a moment in the history of Cahokia that archaeologists have struggled to fully explain, a moment that appears in the archaeological record as something close to a sudden transformation. Around the year 1050 of the Common Era, something happened in the American bottom. In a remarkably short span of time, perhaps within a single generation, possibly even faster, the population of the Cahokia area appears to have surged dramatically. The modest collection of villages that had occupied this stretch of floodplain for centuries was replaced, or perhaps more accurately, transformed into something qualitatively different, something larger, something more organized. Something that, when archaeologists first began to recognize its true scale, forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about pre-Columbian North America. A city was being born. Archaeologists call this transformation the Cahokia emergence, and it is one of the most discussed and debated topics in American archaeology. The speed of the change, if it was indeed as rapid as some evidence suggests, is remarkable. Within what may have been the span of a single human lifetime, the American bottom appears to have shifted from a landscape of dispersed agricultural villages into a landscape dominated by a large, planned urban center surrounded by subsidiary communities. The evidence for this rapid transformation comes from multiple sources. Radiocarbon dating of construction materials and artifacts suggests that the great building projects at Cahokia, including the earliest phases of Monks Mound itself, began around this time. Pollen records in nearby lake sediments show a dramatic increase in the cultivation of corn, maize, beginning in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, suggesting a shift in agricultural strategy that could support a much larger population. And the archaeological signature of the surrounding landscape changes sharply at roughly this same moment, with smaller villages appearing to empty out, while the central site grows larger and more elaborate. What caused this transformation? That is a question scholars are still actively debating. One possibility is that Cahokia's rise was triggered by the arrival of a new or significantly expanded agricultural technology, specifically the widespread adoption of a particularly productive variety of maize, sometimes called Eastern flint corn, that was better suited to the climate and soils of the American bottom than earlier varieties. If corn production suddenly became dramatically more efficient and reliable, that could have supported a much larger population in a much smaller geographic area, which might explain the apparent concentration of people at Cahokia in this period. Another possibility is that social and political change drove the transformation, that some form of new leadership or new organizational structure emerged in the American bottom around this time, capable of mobilizing people and resources at a scale that had never been achieved before. Perhaps a charismatic leader or a group of leaders managed to convince or compel thousands of people to come together in one place and contribute their labor to a shared project of unprecedented ambition. A third possibility, and one that many archaeologists consider seriously, is that Cahokia's rise was driven in part by its growing role as a ceremonial center. Religious movements have, throughout human history, demonstrated a remarkable power to draw people together, to motivate collective labor, and to direct resources toward monumental construction. If Cahokia became the site of important ceremonial activities, if it was understood to be a sacred place or the residence of powerful spiritual figures that could have attracted pilgrims, devotees, and newcomers from across a wide region. In all probability, none of these explanations alone is sufficient. The rise of Cahokia was almost certainly the result of multiple forces working together: agricultural surplus, new social organization, religious significance, and geographic advantage, all combining at a particular historical moment to produce something that no one of those factors could have produced alone. But whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable. Thousands of people gathered in the American bottom, homes were built, public spaces were cleared, earth was moved. The great flat plaza at the center of the emerging city was leveled, an enormous engineering project in itself, requiring the removal and redistribution of vast quantities of soil to create the flat, open ceremonial space that would become the heart of urban life. And at the northern edge of that plaza, construction began on the Great Mound, the mound that would eventually rise higher than any other earthwork in North America. The city had begun, and its greatest monument was only just beginning to take shape. Monks Mound, the heart of Cahokia, stand at the base of Monks Mound on a quiet morning, before the visitors arrive and before the sound of highway traffic fully asserts itself over the surrounding landscape, and you will feel something that is difficult to name precisely. It is not quite awe in the dramatic sense. It is something quieter than that. Something more like the feeling of standing in the presence of accumulated time, of looking at something that required not merely labor, but patience, commitment, and a shared understanding of purpose that stretched across generations. The mound rises before you in broad, grassy terraces. Its slopes are gentle now, softened by 8 centuries of rain and frost and biological activity. But even in its worn and weathered state, the scale of it is difficult to absorb all at once. It covers an area of roughly 14 acres at its base, larger than the footprint of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises approximately 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain, and it contains, by conservative estimates, somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 million cubic feet of earth. Every cubic foot of that earth was carried there by hand. This is perhaps the single most important fact to hold in mind when trying to understand Monks Mound. There were no machines, no metal tools for digging, no wheeled carts for hauling. No draft animals, no horses, no oxen to bear the weight of the work. There were baskets, woven from plant fibers, carried on human backs. There were digging sticks and stone tools for loosening the earth. There were human muscles and human will and human organization. And there was time. Monks Mound was not built all at once. It grew through a series of construction episodes spread across perhaps 2 centuries or more. Archaeologists who have studied the mound's internal structure, using a combination of excavation, ground-penetrating radar, and careful analysis of exposed cross-sections, have identified multiple distinct construction phases, each representing a period of intensive labor followed by intervals during which the mound was apparently left to settle. The earliest phase of construction probably began around the late 10th or early 11th century, around the same time that Cahokia itself was beginning its rapid expansion. The initial mound was modest by comparison to what it would eventually become, a low platform, perhaps 20 or 30 feet high, positioned at the northern edge of the great central plaza. But even at this early stage, it was clearly intended to be something more than a simple earthen pile. It was deliberately positioned, it was carefully shaped, and it was oriented with an awareness of the surrounding landscape and the movements of the heavens that suggests a sophisticated cosmological understanding among its builders. Over the following century and more, the mound grew through successive additions. New layers of earth were heaped over existing surfaces. The terraced form that is visible today, 4 distinct levels rising one above the other, was developed gradually as each new phase of construction enlarged and elevated the structure. Different types of soil were used in different phases, some carried from considerable distances, chosen perhaps for specific symbolic or practical properties. Some layers show evidence of being deliberately capped with particular materials, as if each building episode were being formally completed and sealed before the next began. At the summit of the mound, at its highest and most prominent point, there stood, during Cahokia's peak period, a large building. Archaeological evidence for this structure is fragmentary, but the presence of substantial post-molds, the dark stains in the soil left by large wooden posts that have long since decayed, confirms that a significant structure occupied the mound's top. This building may have served as the residence of Cahokia's paramount leader, or as a temple, or as both simultaneously. In many ancient societies, the distinction between a ruler's palace and a sacred space was not clear-cut. Political authority and religious authority often resided in the same place, sometimes in the same person. The view from the summit of Monks Mound would have been extraordinary. On a clear day, the surrounding landscape would have been visible for many miles in every direction. The great central plaza would have spread out directly to the south, a vast, open, meticulously maintained public space, flanked by rows of smaller mounds, and beyond them, the densely packed residential areas of the city. To the west, the Mississippi River would have been visible, glittering and slow, a silver thread connecting Cahokia to the wider world. To the north and east, the forested uplands rose gently above the floodplain. And in every direction, the subsidiary mounds of the city would have been visible, more than 100 of them, scattered across the landscape in patterns that were deliberate, meaningful, and now only partially understood. The mound did not merely dominate the landscape visually, it dominated it symbolically. In many indigenous cosmological traditions across North America, the vertical axis, the connection between earth and sky, between the world below and the world above, was a concept of profound importance. High places were places of power. They brought their occupants closer to the sky, to the sun, to the spiritual forces that governed the natural world. A leader who stood at the summit of Monks Mound stood, in the eyes of those who looked up at him, at the axis of the world. This is not speculation. It is an inference drawn carefully from the architectural evidence, from the positioning of the mound within the larger city, from the alignment of structures with solar events, and from the broader comparative record of Mississippian culture across the American Southeast and Midwest. A culture that, as we will discuss in later chapters, shared a rich and complex set of religious and cosmological beliefs. The labor required to build Monks Mound and to maintain it, repair it, and expand it over the course of more than a century was staggering. Estimates vary, but some calculations suggest that the total construction effort represented tens of millions of person-hours of work. This was not labor extracted under conditions of pure coercion. Communities that build on this scale over this length of time typically do so because the construction itself has meaning, because participating in it is understood as an act of devotion, of communal identity, of connection to something larger than oneself. The people who carried those baskets of earth up the growing slopes of Monks Mound were not merely laborers. They were, in some sense, worshippers, participants in an act of creation that expressed their community's deepest values and beliefs. Monks Mound still stands today. It has survived 8 centuries of weathering, the disruptions of European settlement, the encroachment of modern development, and the indignities of being partially excavated by curious and not always careful hands. It is imperfect and worn, but it remains. And it remained only one part of a much larger and more complex city. Walking through ancient Cahokia, close your eyes for a moment, if you can, and try to imagine it. The year is perhaps 1100 of the Common Era. The morning is cool and clear. The sun has just crested the horizon to the east, sending long, low shafts of golden light across the great central plaza of Cahokia. The plaza is enormous, roughly 50 acres of flat, open ground, carefully maintained, swept clean of debris by the people who understand it to be the ceremonial heart of the city. Its surface is firm and compacted. During the dry season, it turns pale and hard. During wet periods, it holds moisture, becoming softer underfoot. At the northern edge of the plaza, Monks Mound rises against the sky, its terraces catching the early light, the great building at its summit throwing a long shadow across the mound's lower slopes. You are standing near the southern edge of the plaza, and you are not alone. The city around you is alive. Cahokia, at its peak, was home to somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people living within the immediate urban core, with additional tens of thousands more living in the subsidiary towns and villages that stretched across the American bottom and beyond. All of them oriented toward Cahokia as the dominant center of their social, economic, and spiritual world. The residential neighborhoods of the city surrounded the central district on multiple sides. Homes in Cahokia were typically built using a construction technique called wall trench architecture, a method in which wooden posts were set into long, narrow trenches dug into the earth. Then the posts were connected by woven wattle, interlaced branches and sticks, and plastered with daub, a mixture of clay, grass, and water that hardened to a relatively durable surface. Roofs were thatched with grass or covered with bark. Floors were sometimes plastered and smoothed. Centrally placed hearths provided heat for cooking and warmth during the cold months. These homes were not large by modern standards. A typical Cahokian household structure might measure 15 to 20 feet on a side, enough space for a family group to sleep, store food, conduct household activities, and shelter from the weather. But they were not crude. They were carefully built, oriented with attention to prevailing winds and solar exposure, and maintained with evident care. Neighborhoods in Cahokia were organized around smaller open spaces, courtyard areas shared among groups of households that likely represented extended family units or social groups with common identities. These neighborhood plazas were smaller versions of the Great Central Plaza, and they served a similar range of functions: gathering spaces, work areas, locations for communal activity and celebration. Moving through the city, you would encounter a range of specialized structures. Some buildings were clearly larger than ordinary homes, positioned on low platform mounds or in prominent locations within neighborhoods, suggesting that they served communal or elevated social functions, meeting places, the residences of local leaders, structures associated with specific crafts or ritual activities. Workshops were scattered throughout the residential areas. Cahokia was a city of production, not merely a ceremonial center, but a place where craftspeople worked with skill and purpose, producing goods for local use and for trade. Archaeologists have found evidence of workshops specializing in the production of flint tools, where skilled knappers shaped chert and other stones into points, scrapers, and blades with a precision that speaks to years of practiced expertise. Other workshops processed shells brought from distant coastal regions, shaping them into beads, pendants, and ornaments that served both decorative and symbolic purposes. Still others worked copper, that most prized of materials, hammering and annealing it into sheets, cutting it into shapes, creating objects of considerable beauty and spiritual power. Near the central district, the character of the city shifted. Here, the buildings were larger and more formally arranged. The mounds were more numerous and more imposing. The open spaces were wider and more carefully maintained. This was the domain of Cahokia's elite, the leaders, the priests, the specialists in ritual knowledge, whose authority derived from their claimed connection to spiritual forces and their ability to mediate between the human community and the powers that governed the natural world. The stockade wall that surrounded the central precinct was a significant feature of the city during certain periods of its history. Archaeological evidence indicates that this wall, constructed of large wooden posts set closely together, forming a barrier that enclosed the central mound group and the Great Plaza, was built and rebuilt multiple times, suggesting that it was an important and actively maintained feature of the urban landscape. Whether it served primarily as a defensive barrier, a symbolic boundary marking sacred from ordinary space, or some combination of both functions, remains a matter of scholarly discussion. Beyond the stockade, the city continued outward in rings of decreasing density, the compact inner neighborhoods giving way to more loosely arranged outer districts, and those in turn giving way to the farmland that supplied the city's food. The boundary between city and countryside was not sharp. It dissolved gradually as the density of settlement thinned and the proportion of agricultural land increased. Along the waterways and drainage channels that threaded through the American bottom, canoes moved constantly, carrying people and goods between Cahokia and the surrounding communities. The river was not merely a source of food and water. It was the city's primary artery of connection, the route by which raw materials arrived, finished goods departed, visitors came, and information traveled. Walking through Cahokia, you would have heard a city in motion. The sound of voices in conversation, the thud of stone tools shaping wood and bone, the crackle of cooking fires, children running across the open plazas, dogs, the only domesticated animal in pre-Columbian Cahokia, moving through the neighborhoods with the easy familiarity of long cohabitation. You would have smelled the smoke of 1,000 fires, the earthy richness of damp soil, the sharp, clean scent of the river on a morning breeze. You would have seen, in the distance, the great mound rising above everything, and you would have understood, as every person in this city understood, that you were living inside something extraordinary, something that the world had never quite seen before in this part of the continent. And that extraordinary city needed to eat. Feeding a megacity, every city, in every era of human history, faces the same fundamental challenge: feeding its people. This challenge is easy to underestimate when you are surrounded by the abundance of a modern grocery store, where food arrives from thousands of miles away, processed and packaged, and available in quantities that would have seemed miraculous to any person who ever lived before the 20th century. But for the people of Cahokia, the question of food was not abstract. It was immediate, seasonal, and consequential. A failed harvest did not mean higher prices at the market. It meant hunger, and with enough consecutive bad seasons, it could mean something far more serious. The agricultural foundation of Cahokia rested, above all else, on corn. Maize, the crop we call corn, had been cultivated in Mesoamerica for thousands of years before it arrived in the American bottom. Its journey northward was gradual, carried by trading relationships and human migration across the centuries. By the time Cahokia began its rapid expansion in the 11th century, maize had become the dominant crop of the American bottom. And the particular variety being cultivated there, a flint corn adapted to the climate of the central Midwest, was productive enough to support a population density that would have been impossible with earlier crops. Maize is a remarkable plant. It produces large quantities of calorie-dense food per acre of cultivated land. It can be dried and stored for months or years without significant loss of nutritional value. It can be prepared in a wide variety of ways: ground into flour, roasted, boiled, fermented. And it can be combined with other crops to create a diet that, while not perfectly balanced by modern nutritional standards, was sufficient to sustain a large population through the demanding physical labor of agricultural life. The fields that fed Cahokia spread across the American bottom in every direction from the city. Some were located on the higher ground above the floodplain, the lowest bluffs and upland prairies where drainage was better and flooding less likely. Others occupied the rich bottomland itself, where the soil was deepest and most fertile, though the risk of spring floods meant that crops planted there required careful timing and a degree of acceptance that nature sometimes had other plans. Corn was the foundation, but it was not the whole of the Cahokian diet. Beans and squash grew alongside corn in the fields, completing a nutritional partnership that has been described as the Three Sisters, a planting system in which corn, beans, and squash are grown together, each contributing to the success of the others. The corn provides structure for the bean vines to climb. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, replenishing what the corn removes. The squash spreads its broad leaves across the ground, reducing moisture loss and suppressing competing weeds. Beyond the cultivated fields, the landscape provided additional food in abundance. The rivers and lakes of the American bottom teemed with fish. Catfish, bass, gar, and bowfin were among the species regularly taken. Shellfish, freshwater mussels in particular, were harvested from river beds and consumed in quantities sufficient to leave enormous middens or refuse heaps that archaeologists have used to reconstruct patterns of dietary practice. Waterfowl were plentiful. The American bottom, positioned along a major migratory flyway, received enormous seasonal concentrations of ducks, geese, and other birds, which were hunted with bows and arrows, nets, and snares. Deer were hunted in the surrounding woodlands. Wild turkeys were taken. Smaller animals, rabbits, squirrels, raccoons, supplemented the diet throughout the year. The management of all these food sources required sophisticated knowledge and careful organization. Someone had to decide which fields to plant and when. Someone had to coordinate the labor of planting, tending, harvesting, and storing crops across a landscape that belonged, in some sense, to a community rather than to individuals alone. Someone had to manage the distribution of food within the city, ensuring that the craftspeople in their workshops, the laborers on the Great Mound construction projects, and the families in every residential neighborhood received enough to eat. Food storage was a critical component of this system. Cahokia could not rely on a continuous supply of fresh food throughout the year. Surpluses from good harvests had to be stored to cover lean periods, the long winter months when cultivation was impossible and hunting was less productive. Archaeological evidence shows that storage pits, underground chambers lined with grass or bark, were common features of Cahokian households and neighborhoods, used to preserve corn, nuts, dried meat, and other storable foods. The management of food surplus may also have been one of the mechanisms by which Cahokia's leadership maintained its authority. Control over stored food, the ability to distribute it in times of shortage, or to withhold it as a form of social pressure, is a powerful tool of governance in any pre-industrial society. If Cahokia's elite controlled, or at least mediated access to, significant food stores, this would have reinforced their position at the top of the social hierarchy in very practical terms. Feeding 20,000 or more people was not merely a logistical challenge, it was a political act. And the fact that Cahokia managed to do it, for as long as it did, speaks to the organizational sophistication of a society that the modern world has too often overlooked. That organizational sophistication extended far beyond the boundaries of the American bottom. Because the food that sustained Cahokia's population was only one part of a larger economic system, a system that reached, through rivers and trails and the ingenuity of human exchange, across enormous distances in every direction, the trade networks of ancient America. It is a quiet afternoon in Cahokia, sometime in the early 12th century. A group of canoes has arrived from the south, moving upriver along a tributary of the Mississippi. The paddlers are lean and experienced, their arms accustomed to the work of river travel. Their canoes are loaded. Some of the cargo is food, dried fish, stored corn, bundles of plant material used for medicine or ceremony, but some of it is something else entirely. Coiled carefully in the bottom of one canoe, wrapped in protective material and treated with the care that valuable things receive, are several large sheets of hammered copper. They have come, these copper pieces, from the Great Lakes region far to the north, from the deposits of native copper found on the Keweenaw Peninsula of what is now Michigan, where indigenous peoples had been mining and working the metal for thousands of years. The copper passed through many hands before it reached this canoe. It traveled south through a chain of exchanges, each community receiving it from one neighbor and passing it on to the next, until it arrived here at the center of the world that Cahokia had become. Copper was the most prestigious material in the Mississippian world. It did not rust. It was beautiful. It could be hammered cold into thin sheets and cut into elaborate shapes without ever needing to be smelted or cast in fire. And it carried with it associations of spiritual power that made objects made from it far more valuable than their physical properties alone could explain. Copper was associated in many indigenous cosmological systems of eastern North America with the sky world, with the sun, with lightning, with the forces of the upper realm that governed weather and cosmic order. To possess copper was, in some sense, to possess a piece of that power. Copper objects found at Cahokia and related sites, sheets cut into falcon shapes, breastplates, earpools, and ceremonial axes, were not decorative objects in the ordinary sense. They were expressions of authority, of spiritual connection, of participation in a world that extended beyond the visible and the everyday. They were displayed by leaders on ceremonial occasions. They were buried with the most important individuals when those individuals died. They were, in the fullest sense of the term, sacred objects. But copper was only one thread in Cahokia's vast web of exchange. Marine shells arrived from the Gulf Coast, a journey of nearly 1,000 miles by river. These shells, particularly the large whelk and conch shells of the Gulf, were fashioned into beads, gorgets, cups, and ceremonial vessels. They too carried spiritual associations, connected in many Mississippian belief systems to the watery underworld, the realm below the earth and below the water, which was the counterpart and complement to the sky world above. Chert, a fine-grained stone ideal for tool production, was quarried in the Ozarks and the uplands east of the American bottom, and brought to Cahokia's workshops, where skilled knappers shaped it into the projectile points, knives, and scrapers that daily life required. Different types of chert, with different colors and textures, were valued differently. Some varieties were associated with particular communities or territories, making them markers of social connection as well as practical tools. Galena, a gray, heavy mineral that produces a bright metallic sheen when polished, was used for ceremonial purposes and as a pigment. It came from deposits in what is now southern Wisconsin and northwestern Illinois, not far in geological terms, but requiring effort and organization to obtain in quantity. Mica, with its glittering, sheet-like structure, arrived from sources in the Appalachian region far to the east, a journey of hundreds of miles. Obsidian, the volcanic glass prized for the unmatched sharpness of its cutting edge, has been found at Cahokia-related sites in quantities that speak to connections reaching all the way to sources in what is now Yellowstone and the Rocky Mountain region. The distances involved in these exchanges, the thousands of miles that materials traveled through successive exchanges, suggest a continent far more connected, far more networked, than many people assume when they think about pre-Columbian North America. Cahokia sat at the center of this network like a hub at the center of a wheel. Its geographic position at the confluence of the Missouri, Mississippi, and Ohio river systems made it naturally accessible from an enormous range of directions. Its political and economic power amplified this natural advantage. Communities that maintained good relationships with Cahokia gained access to its craft production, its religious ceremonies, and its social prestige. Communities that provided raw materials to Cahokia received finished goods, religious participation, and the social capital that came with connection to the continent's most powerful urban center. The trade was not merely economic, it was social, it was political, it was spiritual. Goods that passed through Cahokia's exchange networks were not simply commodities, items priced in some abstract monetary system and traded according to supply and demand. They were embedded in relationships. They carried histories of the people who had made them, used them, and passed them on. Receiving a copper sheet or a marine shell cup from Cahokia was not just an acquisition. It was an act of relationship, an acknowledgement of connection to the city and to the network of communities that the city represented. This embedding of material exchange within social relationships is a pattern that archaeologists recognize across many pre-industrial societies around the world. But what distinguishes Cahokia is the sheer geographic scale of the network and the evidence that the city was actively cultivating and extending these relationships across an enormous portion of the North American continent. Distinctive ceramic styles associated with Cahokia, particularly a type of pottery known as Ramey incised, decorated with scrolling and geometric motifs that reflect the cosmological beliefs of Mississippian culture, have been found at sites scattered across the eastern half of the continent. These ceramics moved through exchange networks, but they also moved through the spread of Cahokian ideas, of religious concepts, artistic conventions, and cultural practices that radiated outward from the great city and left their mark on communities hundreds of miles away. Trade carried goods, and goods carried ideas. The ideas that traveled through Cahokia's exchange networks were among the most powerful that any civilization in pre-Columbian North America ever produced. And many of those ideas were rooted in the spiritual life of the city, in the ceremonies, the symbols, the cosmic order that Cahokia's leaders and priests maintained and expressed through every aspect of the city's design. There is a circle of wooden posts standing in a field not far from Monks Mound, or rather, there was. The posts themselves are long gone, rotted into the earth over the course of 8 centuries, leaving behind only the dark, oval stains in the soil that archaeologists call post molds. But those stains were enough. Enough to reveal that a series of large cedar posts had once stood here in carefully arranged circles, spaced at deliberate intervals, positioned with a precision that required not only skilled labor but sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Archaeologists discovered these post circles during excavations in the 1960s. They identified at least 5 distinct circles over time, some overlapping, some separate, suggesting that the structure was built and rebuilt multiple times as the city grew and its ceremonial needs evolved. The largest of these circles was roughly 410 feet in diameter. The posts that formed it were substantial, perhaps 2 feet or more in diameter, set deep into the earth, rising perhaps 20 or 30 feet above the ground. The name that attached itself to this structure somewhat informally but now widely used, was Woodhenge. The comparison to Stonehenge in England is imprecise in many ways. The two structures were built by entirely different cultures at different times, using different materials for purposes that may have differed in important details. But the comparison captures something real. Like Stonehenge, Cahokia's Woodhenge appears to have been designed with careful attention to solar alignments. Specific posts within the circle align with the position of the rising sun on the equinoxes, the 2 days each year when day and night are of equal length, and on the solstices, the longest and shortest days of the year. An observer standing at the center of the circle and looking toward a specific post on the morning of the spring equinox would have seen the sun rise precisely over Monks Mound in the distance. This alignment, the Great Mound, the wooden post, and the rising equinox sun all falling along the same sight line was almost certainly not accidental. It was designed. What does this tell us? It tells us that the people of Cahokia possessed sophisticated knowledge of the movements of the sun across the year. It tells us that this knowledge was considered important enough to be encoded in permanent, or at least semi-permanent, monumental architecture. And it tells us that the relationship between the city's ceremonial landscape and the cycles of the natural world was a matter of deep, carefully maintained concern. The solar calendar was not merely a practical tool for timing agricultural activities, though it certainly served that function. In many indigenous cosmological traditions, the movements of the sun, moon, and stars were understood as expressions of a moral and spiritual order that governed all of existence. The solstices and equinoxes were not simply astronomical events. They were moments of cosmic significance, turning points in the great cycle of creation and renewal that sustained the world. A leader or a priestly figure who could stand at the center of Woodhenge and demonstrate, through the precise alignment of post and sunrise, a special relationship with the sun and its cycles, possessed something extraordinarily powerful, not merely political authority, not merely economic control, something deeper. Something that spoke to the fundamental question of cosmic order, of whether the world would continue to turn, whether the seasons would return, whether the crops would grow. The ability to mediate between the human community and the forces that govern the natural world was, in many pre-industrial societies, the ultimate source of authority. And the evidence from Cahokia's Woodhenge suggests that this ability was cultivated with great care and expressed through the city's very design. Ceremony at Cahokia extended far beyond the observation of solar events. The archaeological record, fragmentary as it always is, provides glimpses of a rich and complex ceremonial life that permeated every aspect of the city's existence. The great central plaza was itself a ceremonial space. Its careful maintenance, the deliberate removal of debris, the smoothing of its surface, the prevention of any permanent construction within its boundaries, suggests that it was understood as a place set apart from ordinary daily life. Gatherings here may have included public rituals, feasts, games, and ceremonies connected to the agricultural calendar, to political occasions, and to the spiritual needs of the community. Chunky, a game played with a stone disc and long poles, was one activity that archaeologists believe was conducted in open public spaces like the Great Plaza. Stone discs associated with chunky play have been found at Cahokia and at many related Mississippian sites. The game had, in many indigenous traditions, significance that went beyond mere recreation. It was connected to cosmological ideas, to the resolution of disputes, and to the expression of competitive relationships between individuals and groups. Watching or participating in chunky was, in some contexts, a form of participation in the social and spiritual life of the community. The dead, too, were part of Cahokia's ceremonial world. Burial mounds at Cahokia contained not only the remains of important individuals, but evidence of elaborate funerary ceremonies that speak to a complex understanding of death, the afterlife, and the relationship between the living and the departed. The most famous of these burial contexts, excavated at a mound now designated as Mound 72, revealed a tableau of extraordinary complexity and, by any honest accounting, considerable darkness. Beneath Mound 72, archaeologists found the remains of a man, probably a high-status individual, possibly a paramount leader, lying on a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, perhaps a falcon. Near him were deposited large quantities of other prestige goods, copper, mica, arrows, and more. And around this central burial were the remains of other individuals, many of them young women, buried in groups, apparently sacrificed as part of the funerary ceremony. The evidence from Mound 72 is deeply thought-provoking, and scholars have discussed it extensively. It suggests a society in which the power of the highest status individuals extended, at least on ceremonial occasions, to a degree that most modern observers find difficult to contemplate calmly. The practice of human sacrifice, if that is indeed what the Mound 72 evidence represents, which most archaeologists believe it does, speaks to a cosmological worldview in which the death of certain individuals could serve a cosmic purpose, could participate in the renewal of the world, could transfer spiritual power from one realm to another. These were not the acts of a simple or unsophisticated society. They were the expressions of a complex theological tradition, one that we understand only partially, and that we must approach with both intellectual curiosity and genuine respect for the people whose lives and deaths it encompassed. The spiritual life of Cahokia was inseparable from every other aspect of its existence. Architecture, agriculture, trade, governance, all of these were embedded in a religious understanding of the world that gave them meaning and direction. And that religious understanding shaped, above all else, the question of who held power and how that power was exercised over the thousands of people who called Cahokia home. History has a tendency to speak most clearly about the powerful, the leaders, the priests, the builders of great monuments. The people whose names and deeds were worth remembering, worth carving into stone or preserving in written records. But Cahokia left no writing. It left no inscriptions naming its rulers or recording its laws. What it left was the accumulated evidence of lives lived, the fragments of pottery dropped and broken, the post molds of homes built, and abandoned, the seeds of crops long consumed. The bones of people who worked and ate and slept and raised children and grew old in this city nearly 1,000 years ago. From this evidence, patient and careful archaeologists have begun to reconstruct something of what ordinary life in Cahokia was actually like. And that reconstruction reveals a city that was, for all its monumental ambitions, fundamentally a human place. A place of families, of daily routines, of small pleasures and ordinary difficulties, of the kind of life that most people in most times and places have led. A morning in Cahokia might begin before dawn. The fires that had burned low through the night would be stoked back to life. The first light coming through the smoke hole in the roof would signal the beginning of a day that was, for most people, organized around the immediate demands of subsistence and household maintenance. Women played central roles in the domestic economy. The processing of corn, grinding dried kernels into flour using stone manos, and metates, the grinding stones that have been found in abundance at Cahokian sites, was a time-consuming and physically demanding task that was typically performed by women. Often in communal settings where the work could be combined with conversation and the maintenance of social bonds. Cooking, food storage, child care, the production of textiles and ceramic vessels. These were the activities that structured much of the daily rhythm for women in Cahokia's households. The physical evidence of this work is visible in the skeletal remains of Cahokian women, which show patterns of musculoskeletal stress consistent with the repeated, forceful motions of grinding corn. The bones of the arms and shoulders bear the marks of this labor in ways that are quietly eloquent, a record of thousands of hours of work, written into the very structure of the body. Men were responsible for much of the agricultural labor, the clearing of fields, the planting and harvesting of crops, as well as hunting, fishing, and the construction and maintenance of the built environment. They participated in the long-distance trade expeditions that brought raw materials into the city. They contributed labor to the great public construction projects, the building and rebuilding of mounds, stockade walls, and public structures that were the most visible expressions of Cahokia's collective ambition. Children grew up in a world that was, by the standards of later European-influenced American culture, quite different in its rhythms and expectations. Childhood was not sharply separated from adult life in the modern sense. Children participated in household activities from a young age, learning through observation and gradual involvement the skills that would sustain them as adults. They played. The evidence of play is always present in the archaeological record of any community with children, in the small clay figurines, the informal game pieces, the miniature vessels that appear too small for practical use. Elders held important roles in Cahokian society, as they do in virtually every human community. The accumulated knowledge of experienced farmers, hunters, craftspeople, and healers was an irreplaceable resource for a community that had no written records. This knowledge of the best times to plant and harvest, of the locations of productive hunting grounds, of the techniques for working copper or firing pottery, of the stories and ceremonies that connected the community to its past and its spiritual world, lived in people. It was transmitted through relationships, through apprenticeship, through the careful attention of younger generations to those who had learned before them. Craftspeople occupied a special place in the social fabric of Cahokia. The production of prestige goods, the copper work, the shell ornaments, the carefully made ceremonial pottery required years of skill development and access to rare materials. The people who produced these objects were not merely tradespeople in the ordinary sense. They were artists in the fullest meaning of that word, practitioners of a discipline that combined technical mastery with symbolic knowledge, producing objects that functioned simultaneously as beautiful things and as expressions of a shared cosmological understanding. A craftsperson shaping a sheet of copper into the outstretched wings of a falcon was not merely making an object. They were participating in the visual language of a religious tradition, creating an image that communicated ideas about the sky world, about spiritual power, about the connection between human leaders and cosmic forces. The skill required to produce such objects accurately and beautifully was understood, in all likelihood, as itself a form of spiritual competence. Storytelling bound the community together across time. In a society without writing, stories were the primary technology for preserving and transmitting the knowledge and values that made the community what it was. Stories about the origins of the world, about the relationships between human beings and the spiritual forces that governed nature. About the deeds of ancestors and the lessons of history, these were told and retold in homes and around fires, and in the context of ceremonies, maintaining a continuity of identity and understanding across generations. We cannot hear those stories now. The specific narratives that shaped Cahokian understanding of the world are lost to us, along with the language or languages in which they were told. But we can infer from the material record, from the images on pottery and copper, from the alignments of architecture, from the patterns of burial and ceremony, something of the cosmological framework within which those stories operated. And we can recognize, in all of this evidence, something that is sometimes too easily forgotten when we look at ancient civilizations. These were people, not abstractions, not representatives of an archaeological culture category, not mere producers of artifacts. They were people who loved their children, mourned their dead, argued with their neighbors, felt the cold of winter mornings, tasted the sweetness of the first ripe corn of the harvest season, and looked up at the same stars that we see when we step outside on a clear night. Their world was very different from ours, but their humanity was not. And within that humanity, there were questions of power, of who led and who followed, of who decided and who obeyed, of how authority was established and maintained in a city of tens of thousands of people. Who ruled Cahokia? It is one of the most fundamental questions we can ask about the city, and it is one of the most difficult to answer with certainty. We have no written records. We have no inscriptions naming rulers. We have no chronicles listing the succession of leaders or describing the political arrangements by which the city was governed. What we have is the material record, the evidence of architecture, burial goods, spatial organization, and the distribution of resources. And from that evidence, scholars have constructed careful, reasoned, and sometimes competing interpretations of Cahokia's political organization. The most widely accepted view is that Cahokia was governed by a form of authority that archaeologists and anthropologists describe as a chiefdom, a social and political organization in which power is concentrated in the hands of a paramount leader, sometimes called a chief or a paramount chief, whose authority derives from a combination of hereditary status, religious power, control over resources, and the ability to mobilize labor and organize collective action. This is a broad category, and it encompasses a wide range of actual political arrangements. Some chiefdoms are relatively modest in scale and relatively flexible in their power structures. Others are large, complex, and characterized by significant social stratification, clear distinctions between elite and non-elite, between those who direct and those who labor, between those who consume surplus and those who produce it. Cahokia, at its height, appears to have been at the more complex end of this spectrum. The evidence from Mound 72, with its elaborately furnished central burial, its deposits of prestige goods, and its associated sacrificial burials, suggests a paramount leader whose authority extended to an extraordinary degree. This individual, buried on his bed of shell beads, surrounded by the most valued materials of his world, was not merely a successful political leader in the way a modern politician might be. He was, in the understanding of his community, something closer to a sacred figure. A person whose relationship with the spiritual forces that govern the world was different in kind from that of ordinary people. A person whose death required extraordinary ceremony and, it appears, the deaths of others to be properly managed. This kind of sacralized political authority, sometimes described as divine kingship, though that term carries Eurocentric associations that don't map perfectly onto the Cahokian context, is found in many complex pre-industrial societies around the world. It is a logical development in societies where religious knowledge and political power are concentrated in the same social stratum, and where the authority of leaders depends partly on their claimed ability to intercede with supernatural forces on behalf of their community. Below the paramount leader, Cahokia's social hierarchy was almost certainly complex, with multiple levels of elite status, specialized roles, and gradations of authority. Researchers have identified what appear to be the residences of high-status individuals, larger structures, positioned on platform mounds or in prominent locations, associated with higher concentrations of prestige goods. These residences were probably occupied by members of an aristocratic class, individuals whose social position was, at least partly, inherited, and who served as local leaders, administrators, or ceremonial specialists within the larger political structure. The organization of labor at Cahokia is itself evidence of significant political power at the center. The construction of Monks Mound, the leveling of the Great Plaza, the building and rebuilding of the stockade wall, these projects required the coordination of thousands of workers over extended periods. Food had to be provided for those workers. Tools had to be organized and distributed. The sequence of construction tasks had to be planned and overseen. None of this could have happened without a political structure capable of directing large-scale collective effort. How that direction was achieved, whether primarily through authority that people accepted willingly, through coercive power backed by the threat of force, or through some combination of the two, is a question that the material record cannot fully answer. Most scholars lean toward a view that both voluntary participation and various forms of social pressure were involved, that many people participated in Cahokia's great projects because they believed in their importance, while others may have had less choice in the matter. The relationship between Cahokia and the surrounding subsidiary communities, the towns and villages of the American bottom that looked toward the great city as their central place, was also a political relationship. Cahokia's authority extended outward from its urban core, organizing the regional landscape and directing the flow of resources, labor, and ceremonial participation across a broad territory. How far that authority reached geographically and in terms of its actual power over distant communities is another actively debated question. Some scholars argue for a relatively limited sphere of direct political control, with Cahokia's influence beyond a certain radius being more cultural and religious than strictly political. Others see evidence of a more extensive political network, with Cahokia's leaders exercising real authority over communities at considerable distances. What is clear is that Cahokia was the dominant center of a regional political landscape, the place where authority was concentrated, where important decisions were made, where the most significant ceremonies were conducted, and toward which the surrounding communities were oriented. And for a time, for several generations, that authority held. The city grew, the mounds rose higher, the trade networks expanded, the population increased, the ceremonies continued, but even great cities are not immune to the difficulties that come with success. And Cahokia, in the years after its peak, would face challenges that no amount of political authority or spiritual intercession could fully overcome. There is a version of ancient cities that exists primarily in imagination, a version composed of grand architecture, colorful ceremony, and the impressive achievements of human organization. In this version, the past is a kind of idealized distance, cleaned of its difficulties and simplified into its most impressive elements. The reality of life in Cahokia was more complicated than that. For all its achievements, and they were genuine and remarkable, Cahokia was also a place of physical hardship, health challenges, environmental stress, and the kinds of social tensions that inevitably accumulate when large numbers of people live closely together over extended periods. The health of Cahokia's population is one area where the archaeological record speaks with some directness. Analysis of skeletal remains from burial sites across the Cahokia area has provided bioarchaeologists, scientists who study what human bones can tell us about past lives, with a significant body of evidence about the physical condition of the city's inhabitants. The results of this analysis paint a nuanced picture. On one hand, Cahokia's residents appear to have had access to a reasonably varied diet during the city's peak period. The combination of corn, beans, squash, fish, game and wild plant foods provided a caloric base that was generally adequate, if not by modern standards nutritionally optimal. Corn, in particular, while calorie-dense and storable, is deficient in certain amino acids and in niacin, a B vitamin, when not prepared with an alkali treatment such as the nixtamalization process that was used in Mesoamerica. Whether Cahokians used similar preparation techniques is not entirely clear from the available evidence. On the other hand, the skeletal record shows significant evidence of physical stress and disease. Signs of nutritional deficiency, including porotic hyperostosis, a condition associated with iron deficiency anemia, visible in the structure of skull bones, appear with some frequency in Cahokian burials. Growth disruption markers on teeth, called linear enamel hypoplasia, indicate that many individuals experienced periods of nutritional stress or illness during childhood, moments when growth was temporarily halted and then resumed, leaving a permanent mark on the developing dental enamel. Infectious disease was a significant challenge in any densely populated pre-industrial community. The concentration of thousands of people in a relatively small area, along with their domestic animals, their food stores, and their waste, created conditions that were favorable to the transmission of pathogens. Respiratory infections, gastrointestinal illnesses, and other communicable diseases would have circulated through Cahokia's population with a regularity that modern medicine has made it easy to forget, was once a constant feature of urban life. Tuberculosis may have been present in the Cahokia population, though the skeletal evidence for this diagnosis is sometimes ambiguous. Dental disease, cavities, abscesses, tooth loss was common, driven in part by the high carbohydrate content of a corn-heavy diet. Arthritis and other degenerative joint conditions appear frequently in the adult skeletal population, reflecting a lifetime of physical labor in occupations that placed repetitive stress on the body. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high. The life expectancy at birth, by modern standards, was low, though those who survived childhood and early adulthood might live to relatively advanced ages, accumulating the experience and knowledge that made elders so valuable in pre-literate societies. The environment itself posed ongoing challenges. The American bottom was a landscape shaped by water, and water, for all its gifts of fertile soil, abundant fish, and convenient transportation, was also capable of unpredictable and destructive behavior. The Mississippi River and its tributaries could flood dramatically, particularly in spring, inundating agricultural fields, threatening homes built in low-lying areas, and disrupting the systems of food production and distribution on which the city depended. Evidence from geological studies of the American bottom suggests that significant flood events occurred multiple times during the period of Cahokia's occupation. Some of these floods may have been severe enough to damage crops, destroy stored food supplies, and force the temporary displacement of populations from the most vulnerable areas. Recovering from a major flood required enormous collective effort, repairing structures, replanting fields, rebuilding food stores, at precisely the moments when the community's resources and energy were already most depleted. The deforestation of the surrounding landscape was another environmental challenge that may have grown more acute over time. The construction of Cahokia's buildings, stockade walls, and wooden ceremonial structures required enormous quantities of timber. Estimates suggest that the construction of a single large stockade wall, of which Cahokia saw multiple construction phases, required tens of thousands of large wooden posts. The fuel needs of a city of tens of thousands of people, cooking and heating through cold Midwestern winters, added to the demand for wood, and the clearing of agricultural fields continued to remove forest cover from the surrounding uplands. Over time, this deforestation may have had measurable consequences. Without tree cover, hillsides eroded more readily, sending sediment into streams and increasing the severity and frequency of flooding in the bottomlands. Erosion depleted the productivity of upland agricultural soils. The distance from which timber had to be transporting, as local sources were exhausted, increased the labor required for construction. Population pressure added another layer of complexity. As Cahokia's population grew, the demand for agricultural land intensified. Fields that had once been allowed to rest and recover were brought under continuous cultivation. Soil fertility may have declined in the most intensively farmed areas. The balance between the food needs of the population and the productive capacity of the surrounding landscape became, over time, a relationship with less margin for error. And beneath all of these environmental and biological challenges ran the constant tensions of social life in a hierarchically organized society. The resentments that accumulate when labor is demanded without proportional return, when resources flow upward, while the people who produce them subsist on what remains. When the distance between those at the top of the hierarchy and those at the bottom grows wide enough to strain the bonds of shared identity and mutual obligation. Cahokia at its peak was a remarkable achievement. It was also a city under pressure from the environment, from the demands of its own complexity, and from the internal tensions that complexity inevitably generates. For a time, those pressures were contained. For a time, the city continued to grow, to build, to trade, to celebrate, and to hold together. But then, gradually, something began to shift. Something that the leaders on their Great Mound, and the priests in their ceremonial spaces, and the farmers in their fields, and the craftspeople in their workshops may not have fully understood until the process was already well underway. The city was beginning to change. There is something deeply human about the way great things end. Rarely is there a single moment, a dramatic collapse, a sudden catastrophe, a clear before and after that separates a flourishing civilization from a ruined one. Instead, there is usually a long, slow process. A series of small shifts, each one individually manageable, each one absorbed and adjusted to, until the accumulation of those shifts reaches a point where adjustment is no longer sufficient, where the system that held everything together begins, quietly and almost imperceptibly, to come apart. That is how Cahokia's decline appears to have unfolded, not in a single season, not in a single generation, but over the course of perhaps a century and a half, from sometime in the middle of the 12th century through the late 13th century and into the early 14th, the city slowly, gradually, unmistakably diminished. The population fell. The great construction projects ceased. The trade networks contracted. The subsidiary communities in the surrounding American bottom began, one by one, to empty out, and the people, tens of thousands of people, spread across a wide regional landscape, dispersed. Some moved east, some moved south. Some moved into the river valleys of the interior, joining or founding communities far from the place where their grandparents or great-grandparents had lived their lives. The process was long enough that it was probably not experienced as a single, unified event by the people living through it. For many individuals, the changes happening around them may have been gradual enough to seem like ordinary fluctuations, a difficult season, a shift in where families chose to live, a reduction in the scale of public ceremonies. It is only when we look at the entire arc, compressed by the perspective of centuries, that the pattern becomes unmistakably clear. The evidence for this decline comes from multiple lines of inquiry. Population estimates for Cahokia at its peak, which range, depending on the scholar and the methodology, from around 10,000 to perhaps 20,000 or more, drop significantly in the later phases of the city's occupation. The density of house structures visible in the archaeological record decreases. Sites that were occupied during the peak period show evidence of abandonment, hearths gone cold, storage pits emptied, floors no longer swept, roofs no longer repaired. The city was losing people. The Great Mound construction projects that had defined Cahokia's peak period appear to have slowed and eventually ceased. The later phases of the city's history show less evidence of the large-scale public works that had characterized its golden age. The energy and organizational capacity that had once been directed toward building and maintaining the urban landscape seemed to have been redirected, or perhaps simply dissipated, as the social structures that had mobilized collective labor weakened. The pottery record reflects the same trajectory. The distinctive Rami-incised ceramics, those beautifully decorated vessels that had carried Cahokia's cosmological imagery across the continent, declined in frequency and in the quality of their execution during the later phases. New ceramic styles appeared, suggesting either the influence of incoming populations or a cultural shift in existing ones, but the overall richness of the ceramic tradition appears to diminish over time. The stockade walls around the central precinct were rebuilt multiple times during the city's history. Archaeological evidence shows at least 4 distinct construction phases. Some scholars have interpreted this pattern of repeated rebuilding as evidence of escalating social tension, of a need to protect the elite core of the city from populations whose relationship with their leaders was becoming increasingly strained. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, the evidence of repeated wall construction does suggest a city whose internal dynamics were changing in significant ways. The trade networks that had connected Cahokia to communities across the continent showed signs of contraction. The quantities of exotic materials, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountain region, found in later period contexts at Cahokia, are generally smaller than those associated with the peak period. This could reflect a reduction in the city's ability to attract and retain trade relationships, a decline in the surplus production that had sustained those relationships, or both. Skeletal evidence from later period burials suggests that the health of Cahokia's population may have deteriorated in the later phases of the city's occupation. Some bioarchaeological studies have found higher rates of nutritional stress markers and evidence of increased exposure to infectious disease in later period remains compared to those from the peak period. If accurate, this would suggest that the conditions of daily life for ordinary Cahokians were becoming more difficult over time, a possibility consistent with the broader pattern of decline. What makes the story of Cahokia's decline so fascinating and so frustrating? From the perspective of anyone seeking clear answers, is that the evidence is consistent with multiple possible explanations, and scholars have not reached consensus on which factors were most important or how they interacted with one another. The decline was real. The evidence for it is clear and consistent across multiple lines of inquiry, but the causes of that decline are still, after decades of research, genuinely contested. Several major theories have been proposed. Each has evidence in its favor. Each has aspects that remain uncertain or debated. And the honest truth, the truth that archaeology demands we acknowledge, is that the full story of why Cahokia declined may be more complex than any single theory can capture. Because that full complexity deserves to be explored carefully, let us take the time to consider each of the major explanations in turn. The question of why Cahokia declined has occupied archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists for decades. It is not a simple question, and it does not have a simple answer. But the process of carefully examining the available evidence, of weighing what we know against what we can only infer, of distinguishing established findings from scholarly interpretation, is itself illuminating. It reveals not only something about Cahokia's fate, but something about the nature of complex societies and the forces that challenge them. The first major explanation that researchers have explored is climate change. The medieval warm period, the relatively warm and stable climatic interval that had provided Cahokia with favorable conditions for agricultural production during its rise and peak, did not last forever. Beginning sometime in the 13th century, global climate patterns began to shift. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere started to cool. The interval that climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures, altered precipitation patterns, and increased climatic variability, was beginning to assert itself, though its full effects would not be felt for another century or two. For a city as dependent on agricultural surplus as Cahokia, even modest changes in climate could have had significant consequences. A shortening of the growing season by a few weeks, a reduction in average annual rainfall, an increase in the frequency of late spring frosts. Any of these could have reduced crop yields meaningfully in a system that was already operating with limited margins. If good harvests became less reliable, and if the stored surpluses that buffered against bad years were drawn down faster than they could be replenished, the food security of the entire city could have been compromised. Specific evidence for climatic stress in the Cahokia region comes from several sources. Tree ring records from the broader Midwest region show